They called her the Ghost.
Not out of respect, but out of disdain. For 2 years, Nurse Elara Vance had haunted the pristine, fluorescent-lit corridors of St. Jude's Metropolitan Hospital, a silent wraith in worn, slightly too large grey scrubs. She did the jobs no one else wanted, cleaning up the messes in Trauma Bay 3 after a particularly gruesome code, restocking the endless supply closets, changing the linens of the forgotten patients in the overflow ward. She endured the sneers, the whispered jokes, the overt and casual cruelty of men like Dr. Alastair Finch, the king of this little kingdom. They saw the slight, almost imperceptible limp in her left leg. They saw the network of fine, silvery scars that webbed the back of her right hand, a hand she often kept tucked into her pocket. They saw a woman in her late 30s who looked 50, with tired eyes that held a permanent, resigned sadness. They didn't know that the limp came from a piece of shrapnel she'd taken after pulling a fallen ranger from a burning Humvee outside of Kandahar. They didn't know the scars on her hand were from gripping the jagged edge of a collapsed concrete wall to keep it from crushing a trapped child in Mosul. They didn't expect the day would come when the carefully constructed chaos of their world would shatter, and the only person who could piece it back together would be the ghost they had tried so hard to erase. Elara Vance wasn't a broken-down nurse clinging to the bottom rung of the medical ladder. Elara Vance was a weapon, forged in the crucible of war, and they had absolutely no idea they were sleeping next to a volcano. The air in the emergency department was a familiar, toxic cocktail. It was a layered assault on the senses, the sharp, sterile tang of antiseptic, the cloying sweetness of blood, the bitter undertone of burnt coffee, and beneath it all, the thick, palpable scent of fear.
Elara moved through it like a fish through water,
Her presence barely registering. She collected soiled linens, her movements economical and silent. Her gaze, however, was never still. It swept the room in a constant, subconscious pattern, a habit she couldn't break. Assessing entry points, noting the positions of the security guards, clocking the agitated man in Bay 6 whose fists kept clenching and unclenching. It was a threat assessment matrix running on a low-level, perpetual loop, a ghost of a life she had tried to bury. "Vance!" The voice was a whip-crack in the relative din. Dr. Alastair Finch stood, a god in custom-tailored navy scrubs, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, a Patek Philippe watch gleaming on his wrist. He was handsome in the way of expensive dentistry and inherited confidence. He held up a disposable coffee cup between 2 manicured fingers as if it were a soiled diaper. "This is not a macchiato. This is brown water. Are you incapable of following a simple 3-step instruction from the machine?" A small circle of residents and sycophantic nurses tittered. Elara's face remained impassive. She took the cup from him, her scarred hand brushing his. He flinched, pulling his hand back as if burned. "Sorry, sir," she said, her voice a low rasp, a consequence of disuse and an old injury she never spoke of. "I'll make another." "See that you do," Finch snapped, turning his back on her to pontificate to his audience. "Competence. It's the cornerstone of medicine. From the top," he gestured vaguely at his own chest, "all the way down to the absolute bottom." His eyes flickered toward Elara's retreating back. The laughter was a little louder this time. Elara didn't react. She moved to the staff lounge, the jeers washing over her. Inside, she methodically cleaned the coffee machine, her hands moving with a practiced efficiency. As she worked, her eyes fell on her reflection in the polished chrome of the espresso maker. The face staring back was a stranger's mask. Tired, pale, anonymous. But behind the eyes, something else flickered. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, sparked by the acrid smell of the coffee grounds. The smell of burning diesel and cordite. The rhythmic thump-thump-thump of an incoming Black Hawk. The desperate press of her fingers against a femoral artery, the blood hot and slick. Her own voice, clear and commanding, shouting orders. "Pressure! I need pressure here. Get me 2 units of O-neg and a chest tube kit. Now! Move!" She blinked. The memory dissolved. The only sound was the hum of the lounge refrigerator and the distant, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor from the hallway. She was not Sergeant Vance, call sign Valkyrie, senior combat medic of Task Force 11. She was just Vance, the ghost.
A woman who couldn't even be trusted to make a macchiato.
She finished preparing the coffee, the foam a perfect, creamy white. She placed it on a small tray, her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. She carried it back to the ER floor. She carried it back to the man who saw her as less than human, and placed it on the counter beside him. "Your macchiato, Dr. Finch," she whispered. He didn't even look at her, simply picking it up and taking a sip as he continued his story. The act of service was a shield. The anonymity was a fortress. She had built it wall by wall, insult by insult, to keep the world out and to keep the soldier locked within. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that fortresses could fall. All it took was the right kind of explosion. The day continued its slow, grinding descent. Alara emptied biohazard bins, the red bags heavy with the refuse of human suffering. She wiped down a gurney, methodically erasing the streaks of blood left by a stabbing victim. Each task was a meditation, a way to keep her hands and mind occupied, to prevent them from straying back to muscle memory that had no place here. She could field strip an M4 in under a minute, blindfolded. She could perform a needle decompression with a 14-gauge catheter and the confidence of a concert pianist. She could triage 50 casualties in a bombed-out marketplace using nothing but colored tape and the tone of a man's screams. Here, her skills were reduced to mopping up vomit and fetching coffee. It was a peculiar kind of penance. Dr. Finch, meanwhile, held court. He strode through the ER like a colossus, his voice booming as he diagnosed a simple case of gastritis as a fascinatingly atypical presentation of acute pancreatitis, a real textbook case for you residents. He publicly berated a junior nurse, a young woman named Chloe, with wide, terrified eyes, for using the wrong-sized IV catheter, making her cry. He flirted outrageously with a pharmaceutical rep, his laugh echoing off the linoleum floors. He was a caricature of authority, a man so enamored with his own reflection he couldn't see the cracks in the mirror. Later, in the quiet of the supply closet, Chloe was trying to stifle her sobs. Alara was there, counting gauze pads, her back to the door. She didn't turn around, didn't offer platitudes. She simply spoke to the shelves in her low, raspy voice. "He does that to feel tall." Chloe sniffled, wiping her eyes. "He's the department head. He's brilliant." Alara paused in her counting. She placed a stack of 4x4s on the shelf with millimeter precision. "Brilliance and competence are not the same thing," she murmured, more to herself than to the young nurse. "One is performance. The other is survival." "What?" Chloe asked, confused. Alara turned, her face a blank mask, but her eyes held a flicker of something ancient, something weary. "The catheter you chose was a 20-gauge. The patient was stable, good veins. It was appropriate for a saline lock. His preferred 18 gauge would have been more painful and unnecessary. You made the right clinical decision. He made the theatrical one. She turned back to her shelves. The conversation was over. Chloe stood there, stunned into silence. No one had ever defended her, not even so obliquely. She looked at the ghost, this strange, silent woman, and for the first time, she felt a sliver, not of pity, but of awe. The accumulation of slights was a physical weight. Finch's cruelty was a constant, grinding pressure. Around 3 p.m., a man was brought in from a homeless encampment, his body ravaged by sepsis, his feet a mess of necrotic tissue. The smell was overwhelming. The nurses recoiled. Finch, passing by, waved a hand in front of his face. "For God's sake, get him cleaned up and ship him to county. We're not a flophouse." He didn't even break stride. Alara, however, stopped. She saw the man's faded tattoo, a faded eagle, globe, and anchor on his forearm. Marine. She quietly went to work, ignoring the stench. She got warm water and soft cloths. She cleaned his face, spoke to him in a low, soothing tone, even though he was barely conscious. "Easy now, Marine. You're safe." She treated him with a dignity he hadn't been afforded in years. One of Finch's resident sycophants, a smarmy man named Dr. Evans, smirked as he walked by. "Giving the corpse a sponge bath, Vance. Don't you have floors to sweep?" Alara didn't look up. Her hands, one scarred, one not, continued their gentle work. She was tending to a fallen soldier. It was the only language she had left. The injustice simmered, a low fire in the pit of her stomach. The hospital's mission statement, carved into the marble wall of the lobby, spoke of compassion and dignity. Here, in the trenches of the ER, those words were just hollow echoes. The first sign that the world was about to end was a subtle shift in the air, a new sound, a distant chorus of sirens that grew steadily, relentlessly, from a faint whine to a deafening roar. It wasn't one siren or two, it was a symphony of them, a wave of noise that seemed to be rolling directly towards St. Jude's. The triage nurse's phone rang, her face paling as she listened. "Multiple casualties," she shouted, her voice tight with panic. "Downtown, a scaffolding collapse at the new federal building construction site. They're saying dozens. Oh, God, they're all coming here." The ER, once a place of controlled chaos, exploded. The shift supervisor barked orders, a poor imitation of command. "We need more beds. Clear the bays. Call in the on-call staff, now." Nurses and doctors scrambled, their movements frantic, inefficient. A wave of nervous energy washed through the room. Dr. Finch appeared, clapping his hands together with a theatrical flair. "All right, people, listen up. This is what we trained for. Triage protocols are in effect. I want senior residents in the trauma bays. Nurses, prep for mass transfusion. I will be lead physician. Everything, and I mean everything, goes through me. Is that clear?" He surveyed his kingdom. A general before a battle, he was certain he would win. Alara stood by the supply carts, an island of stillness in the swirling panic. She wasn't scrambling. She wasn't shouting. She was watching, listening. The cadence of the approaching sirens told her everything. Too many, too fast. This wasn't just a construction accident. The proximity to a federal building pinged a different part of her brain. Her hand subconsciously went to her thigh, where a tourniquet used to be strapped. The ghost of its weight was a familiar comfort. The first ambulance screamed into the bay, its doors flying open. 2 paramedics wrestled with a gurney. The patient was a man in a dusty, torn suit, his face a mask of blood, a steel rebar piercing his chest just below the clavicle. A sucking chest wound bubbled with every ragged breath. Finch strode forward. "All right, get him in Bay 1. Let's get a chest tube, large-bore IVs, type and cross for 6 units." The paramedics were already being swarmed by more arrivals. A second ambulance, a third, a fourth. The ER was flooded with the broken and the bleeding. Dust-covered construction workers, pedestrians caught in the collapse. The air thickened with the smell of dust and iron. Cries of pain mingled with the frantic shouts of the medical staff. It was a maelstrom. And then, the one patient who would change everything arrived. He didn't come by ambulance. A fleet of black SUVs with government plates screeched to a halt outside the ER entrance. Men in dark suits and earpieces, their jackets bulging with the outline of sidearms, burst through the doors, shouting, "Clear a path! Federal agent, clear a path!" They carried a man on a backboard. He was older, with distinguished white hair, now matted with blood and concrete dust. His breathing was shallow, his face ashen grey. A panicked-looking agent was trying to hold pressure on a gaping wound in his abdomen. "It's Senator Thompson," he yelled. "He was on site for the tour. He's bleeding out." The entire ER froze. The name hung in the air, heavy and cold. Senator Thompson, chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, a man whose face was on the news every night. The air seemed to suck out of the room. The chaos coalesced into a single point of terrifying focus. "Doctor." Finch's eyes widened, a flicker of fear warring with avarice. This was it, the case that would make his career, or break it. He shoved a junior doctor out of the way. "Bring him to me, Bay 2, now!" he commanded, his voice a little too loud, a little too shrill. "I need vitals. Get me the ultrasound machine. I'm in charge here." The agents, bristling with anxiety and aggression, swarmed around the gurney, creating a frantic, unhelpful perimeter. They pushed the senator into Bay 2. Finch followed, barking a stream of contradictory orders. "Get me a central line kit. No, wait, 2 large-bore peripherals first. Page surgery. Page them again. Where's that ultrasound?" Elara watched from the doorway of the bay, her quiet observer status intact. She saw what Finch, in his panic, did not. She saw the rapid, thready pulse in the senator's neck. She saw the distended abdomen growing more rigid by the second. She saw the pale, clammy skin, the classic sign of profound shock. And she saw the agent's hand, slick with blood, failing to control the hemorrhage. They were losing him, not in minutes, in seconds. The beeping of the cardiac monitor attached to the senator began to slow, the pitch dropping ominously. Beep, beep, beep. The happy rhythmic chime devolved into a long, drawn-out tone of doom. The monitor flatlined. A collective gasp went through the room. The long, unbroken scream of the machine was the sound of absolute failure. "He's in VFib. No, asystole. Get the paddles," Finch shouted, his voice cracking. "Charge to 200. A nurse fumbled with the defibrillator, her hands shaking. "Clear!" Finch yelled, pressing the paddles to the senator's chest. The body jumped. The flat line on the monitor didn't waver. Again, "Charge to 300. The smell of burnt hair filled the air. The body jumped again. Nothing. The flat line held, steady and mocking. "He's gone," one of the agents whispered, his face ashen. "Oh God, he's gone." Finch stared at the monitor, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. His career was flashing before his eyes, not in a blaze of glory, but as a smouldering ruin. The king had been checkmated. He was frozen, paralyzed by the enormity of his failure. The room was dead silent, save for the piercing wail of the monitor. And in that silence, a new sound emerged. A voice, low, calm, and resonant with an authority that cut through the panic like a razor. "Stop!" Everyone turned. Elara Vance had stepped into the bay. The ghost. She was no longer stooped. She stood tall, her limp gone, replaced by a solid, planted stance. Her tired eyes were gone, replaced by irises of cold, hard steel. She didn't look at Finch. She didn't look at the agents. Her entire focus was on the body on the gurney. "You're shocking a dead man, Doctor," she stated, her voice devoid of its earlier rasp.
It was a statement of fact.
Not an accusation. He's not in a shockable rhythm. He's in PEA, secondary to massive internal hemorrhage. You're wasting time. Finch stared at her as if she'd grown a second head. "What did you say?" "Get out of here, Vance. This is my scene." Elara didn't move. She took another step toward the gurney. "There's no time to get him to an OR. He has maybe 90 seconds of oxygenated blood left in his brain before it's irreversible. We do it here. Now." "Do what?" one of the agents demanded, stepping toward her. "Who the hell are you?" Elara's eyes met his. For a split second, the agent, a man trained in threat recognition by the Secret Service, felt an involuntary jolt of fear. He saw something in her eyes he'd only ever seen in the eyes of Tier 1 operators in briefing rooms at Langley. He stopped dead.
I need a number 10 scalpel.
A jiggly saw, if you have one. If not, trauma shears will do. 2 large rib spreaders, and every lap sponge you can find, Elara commanded, her voice ringing with the clarity of a field radio. She wasn't asking, she was ordering. A nurse, the young Chloe, simply stared for a second, then, moved by an instinct she didn't understand, she turned and ran to get the supplies. "Vance, I am ordering you to step away from my patient," Finch shrieked, his voice climbing an octave. "You're a nurse. You can't—" "He's not your patient anymore," Elara said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm level. "He's a casualty, and you are relieved." She turned to the 2 largest agents. "You two, I need you to hold him down. Hard. This is going to be violent." Without waiting for a reply, she grabbed a bottle of betadine from a nearby cart, wrenched the top off, and poured the brown liquid over the senator's chest and abdomen in a single, practiced motion. Chloe returned, her arms full of sterile packs. Elara ripped open the scalpel packaging with her teeth and took the blade. Her scarred hand was rock steady. "What are you doing?" Finch whispered, horrified. You're going to do a thoracotomy? Here? That's butchery." "No, Doctor," Elara said, positioning the scalpel over the senator's sternum. "This is called resuscitative surgery." Her eyes were cold fire. "It's what we do when the alternative is a body bag." She pressed the blade down. The skin parted. Blood welled. The room held its breath. The ghost was gone. In her place stood a surgeon of a different, more brutal school. The quiet nurse they had all mocked was about to perform a procedure that most of them had only ever read about in textbooks. A desperate, last-ditch maneuver from the battlefields of Afghanistan, right here in the pristine, panicked heart of St. Jude's Metropolitan Hospital. The clock was ticking. 90 seconds. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the countdown. The wail of the flatline monitor was the only soundtrack. Elara worked with a speed and precision that was inhuman. It wasn't medicine. It was a form of controlled, hyper-efficient violence. Her hands one scarred and one pristine, moved in a blur of terrifying purpose. Slice. The number 10 scalpel slid down the senator's sternum, a clean, deep line from the sternal notch to the xiphoid process. It was a move of utter confidence. There was no hesitation, no tremor. The residents watching felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't the careful, layered incision of a surgeon in an OR. This was a battlefield entry. "She's cutting through the sternum," one of the junior doctors gasped. "She'll sever the mammary artery." "It's already clamped by the surrounding tissue pressure. She's not going deep enough for that. She's just scoring the bone," a voice said. It was Chloe, repeating something Alara had just muttered under her breath, her own eyes wide with a mixture of terror and absolute awe. Alara tossed the scalpel onto the tray. Clatter. "Shears." Chloe slapped the heavy-duty trauma shears into her waiting palm. Snip. Crack. Snip. With powerful rhythmic squeezes, Alara cut through the cartilage, connecting the ribs to the sternum on the left side. The sound of cracking bone and cartilage was sickeningly loud in the silent room. The agents holding the senator's body flinched, but held fast, their knuckles white. "Rib spreaders," Alara commanded, not looking up. 2 heavy steel instruments were placed in her hands. She inserted the tips into the incision and began cranking them open. There was a wet, tearing sound as the chest cavity was forced apart, exposing the still, silent heart and the pale, deflated lung. It was a visceral, brutal sight, a gaping window into death itself. Finch made a gagging sound. "You've killed him! You lunatic! You've butchered him!" Alara ignored him. Her eyes were locked on the pericardial sac surrounding the heart. It was swollen, tense, and had a dark, bluish-purple hue. "Cardiac tamponade," she breathed. "The rebar must have nicked the pericardium on its way in." Blood was trapped in the sac, squeezing the heart, preventing it from beating. The defibrillator had been useless because the heart was being physically strangled. She grabbed a large syringe with a long needle, a cardiac needle she'd spotted on the crash cart, and with a surgeon's precision, plunged it into the sac. She pulled back on the plunger. The syringe filled with dark, non-clotting blood. As she drew the fluid out, the heart, freed from the immense pressure, gave a single, spastic flutter. On the monitor, the flat line blipped. A single, weak complex appeared. Then another. Beep, beep. A collective sigh of relief, of pure, unadulterated shock, swept through the onlookers. She got a rhythm back," someone whispered. But Alara wasn't celebrating. "That's not the primary bleed," she snapped, her eyes already scanning lower. "The abdomen is still rigid. He's bleeding out from below the diaphragm. I need to get supraceliac aortic control." She reached a gloved hand deep into the chest cavity behind the now weakly beating heart. Her fingers probed, her touch impossibly delicate for the brutal context. The residents, and even Finch, couldn't fathom what she was doing. It was anatomy beyond their ken, performed under impossible conditions. "I have the descending aorta," she announced. Her fingers, deep inside the senator's chest, were pinching shut the largest artery in his body, a human clamp, stopping the torrent of blood flow to the lower body. It was an act of incredible strength and anatomical knowledge. A temporary, desperate fix. "This buys us minutes. Someone get their hand in his abdomen and find the source of the bleed. Now!" No one moved. They were all frozen, staring at the woman who had just cracked open a United States senator's chest and was now holding his aorta in her hand. They were doctors, but they were out of their depth, terrified of the carnage. Alara's eyes, burning with cold fire, scanned the terrified faces. "Move!" she roared, the voice of a sergeant who had seen men hesitate before and watched them die for it. "Dr. Finch, you're the lead physician. Get your hands dirty or get out of my way." Finch, pale and trembling, looked from Alara's face to the gaping wound in the senator's abdomen. He took a half-step forward, then stopped. He couldn't do it. The sight of the raw, exposed organs, the sheer volume of blood. He was a diagnostician, a manager. He wasn't a butcher. He was a coward. "I can't," he whimpered, taking a step back. Alara's lips tightened into a thin white line. Disgust radiated from her. "Useless." She looked past him, her eyes locking on Chloe. "You, nurse, glove up. I'll talk you through it." Chloe, who had been crying over a 20-gauge catheter an hour ago, looked terrified. But she also looked at Alara, at the impossible calm and competence radiating from her, and a strange courage filled her. She nodded, pulling on a pair of sterile gloves. "Okay," Alara said, her voice dropping into a calm, instructional tone. "Feel for the liver. It's the large, solid organ on the right. Now go underneath it. You're looking for the portal triad. There's a laceration to the hepatic artery. You'll feel the tear. Put pressure on it. Direct, firm pressure." Guided by Alara's voice, Chloe, trembling, plunged her hands into the bloody cavity. She flinched, but didn't pull back. I think I feel it," she stammered. "Good. Hold it. Don't let go, no matter what," Alara commanded. Her own arm, buried to the elbow in the senator's chest, had to be cramping, the muscles screaming in protest. But she gave no sign. Her face was a mask of pure concentration. "Vitals?" she barked. "Blood pressure is coming up, 60/40, a resident called out, his voice shaking with disbelief. "Heart rate is stabilizing at 80. "He's alive," one of the agents breathed, staring at Alara with something akin to religious reverence. "You saved him." The moment of fragile victory was shattered by Finch. His fear and humiliation had curdled into venomous rage. He saw his authority usurped, his incompetence laid bare in front of his entire department. He saw the looks of awe being directed not at him, but at the ghost, the woman he had tormented for 2 years. He snapped. "This is assault!" he screeched, his voice a hysterical shriek. "She's not a surgeon. She has no privileges for this. She mutilated this man. Security! Security, get in here now!" He lunged, not for Alara, but for Chloe, grabbing her shoulder to pull her away. "Get your hands off him! You're contaminating my crime scene!" Alara's head snapped up. Her eyes, which had been focused on the patient, now locked onto Finch. The cold concentration was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. It was the look of a predator whose kill was being threatened. "Don't touch my nurse," she hissed, each word a spike of ice. "Security!" Finch screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Alara. "Arrest this woman. She's a maniac. She's tried to murder a senator." 2 burly hospital security guards, drawn by the commotion, pushed their way into the bay. They were used to dealing with drunks and distraught family members. They saw Dr. Finch, the head of the department, screaming, and a nurse with her arm buried in a patient's chest. It was an easy calculation for them. "Ma'am, you need to step away from the patient," the first guard said, his hand resting on his holstered taser. Alara didn't even look at him. "If I let go of this aorta, he dies in 30 seconds. If she nodded her head toward Chloe, lets go of that artery, he dies in 60. So you have a choice. You can stand there and wait, or you can make yourself useful. Get me a transport team, and a direct line to the senior cardiovascular surgeon at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. Tell them to prep for a massive vascular repair. Tell them, Valkyrie is calling. The guard just stared, confused. Valkyrie? He looked at Finch, who was practically vibrating with fury. I gave you an order. Get her out of here. Drag her out if you have to. Sir, she says. I don't care what she says. She's a nobody, a floor nurse. Get her, Finch commanded.
The first guard,
A man named Henderson, who just wanted to get through his shift, made a fatal mistake. He reached out and grabbed Alara's free arm, his fingers digging into her bicep. Let's go, lady. You're done. The moment his fingers closed around her arm, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It was like a switch being flipped. Alara's head turned slowly, her neck muscles cording. She looked at the guard's hand on her arm, then up at his face. The cold fire in her eyes had been replaced by a flat, dead emptiness that was 1,000 times more terrifying. Take your hand off me, she said. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. I'm not going to ask you again, the guard said, trying to sound tough, but his voice wavered. He saw something in her face that made the hairs on his arms stand up. Fine, Alara said, and then she moved. It was a small, economical motion, a shift of her weight, a twist of her hips. Her free hand, the scarred one, came up and seized the guard's wrist. Her thumb found a pressure point, a nerve cluster he didn't know he had. She applied a micro-ounce of pressure. The guard screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony. His fingers sprang open as if electrocuted. His entire arm went numb, and he stumbled back, clutching his wrist, his face a mask of shock and pain. The second guard drew his taser. Freeze! Alara didn't even look at him. She was still holding the aorta, still keeping the senator alive with one hand. But her entire being was now focused on the external threat. You fire that taser, and the electrical impulse will throw his heart back into arrhythmia, she stated calmly. He will die. The Secretary of Defense will want to know why a hospital security guard electrocuted the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. I imagine that will be a very unpleasant conversation for you. The guard froze, the taser shaking in his hand. Now, Alara continued in that same deadly calm voice. As I was saying before I was so rudely interrupted, get me Walter Reed on the phone. Finch, seeing his authority completely disintegrate, lost the last of his composure. She assaulted an officer. I want her removed. I want her charged. He grabbed the first guard's arm. Drag her out. I'll hold the artery. He made a move to push past Chloe, to plunge his own incompetent hands into the senator's body. It was in that precise, chaotic moment, as a disgraced doctor prepared to commit manslaughter and 2 security guards stood paralyzed, that a new voice cut through the air. It was a voice accustomed to commanding armies, a voice that didn't need to be loud to be heard over the din of a battlefield or an emergency room. Stand down. The voice was gravel and authority. It came from the entrance to the bay. Standing there was a man who seemed to suck all the light and air out of the room. He was in his late 60s, ramrod straight, in a perfectly pressed Army Class A uniform. 4 silver stars glittered on each shoulder board. He was flanked by 2 more men, colonels in dress blues, and behind them a phalanx of grim-faced men in tactical gear with rifles held at a low ready. The Secret Service agents, who had been aggressive and territorial, seemed to shrink, their own authority utterly eclipsed. General Marcus Thorne, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had just entered the building. His eyes, the color of chips of granite, swept the scene. The open chest, the terrified doctors, the cowed security, the hysterical Dr. Finch. And then his gaze fell on the woman with her arm buried in the patient's chest. The general's entire demeanor changed. The terrifying hardness in his eyes softened, replaced by something that looked shockingly like relief and reverence. "Valkyrie," General Thorne said, his voice now quiet, imbued with a profound respect. "I should have known if anyone could pull a rabbit out of this hat, it would be you." The room went dead silent. The only sounds were the steady, weak beeps of the heart monitor. Valkyrie. The name echoed in the silence. The security guard who had grabbed her arm felt a cold dread snake down his spine. Dr. Finch stared, his mouth hanging open, his face a comical picture of confusion and terror. General Thorne took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Alara. "Report," he commanded, the single word holding more power than all of Finch's blustering shouts. Alara, still holding the aorta, never broke her concentration on the patient. "Sir," she replied, her voice crisp, formal, the voice of a soldier reporting to a commanding officer. "Senator Thompson, victim of structural collapse, sustained penetrating trauma to the chest and abdomen, presented in asystole, found to be in PEA, secondary to cardiac tamponade, and massive internal hemorrhage. Performed emergency resuscitative thoracotomy and laparotomy. Pericardial tamponade relieved. Manual control of supraceliac aorta established. Suspected laceration to hepatic artery, currently under manual pressure by nurse Chloe Martin." She gave a slight nod toward Chloe, giving her official credit in the report. "Patient is hemodynamically unstable but has a perfusing rhythm. He requires immediate transfer to a Level 1 trauma center with cardiothoracic and vascular surgical capabilities. I recommend Walter Reed." The general listened, nodding slowly. He wasn't listening to a nurse. He was listening to a peer, a highly skilled specialist giving her professional assessment. He turned his granite gaze on Dr. Finch. "And who are you?" he asked, his voice flat and cold. Finch, flustered, tried to draw himself up. I am Dr. Alistair Finch, Chief of Emergency Medicine. This is my department. And this nurse—" "This nurse," General Thorne interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl, "is Chief Warrant Officer 5, Alara Vance, retired, formerly of the 24th Special Tactics Squadron, and the single most decorated combat medic in the last 50 years of United States military history. She has 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, a Silver Star, and 7 Bronze Stars with Valor. The last time I saw her, she was performing this exact procedure on me in a ditch outside Fallujah, with nothing but a K-bar and a half-burnt flare for light. She saved my life and the lives of 6 other men that day." A wave of shock, so profound it was almost physical, rolled through the room. Jaws literally dropped. The residents, the nurses, the security guards, they all stared at the ghost, the quiet, broken woman who fetched coffee, and tried to reconcile that image with the living legend the general was describing. Chief Warrant Officer 5, 24th STS. Those were designations that meant little to civilians, but to the military personnel present, they were akin to announcing the presence of a god. The 24th was the Air Force's equivalent of Delta Force, or SEAL Team 6. They were the ghosts who went where no one else could. Thorne took another step, his eyes boring into Finch. "Her call sign is Valkyrie, because in every hellhole this country has sent its sons and daughters to die in for the last 20 years, She was the one who decided who lived and who died, and she was almost never wrong. He gestured with his chin toward Alara. She is holding Senator Thompson's life in her hand, and you, his voice dripped with contempt, were trying to have her arrested. Finch's face, which had been red with rage, was now chalky white. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His custom scrubs suddenly looked like a cheap costume. I didn't know, he stammered. She has no credentials here. She's just a nurse. Her credentials, the general bit out, have been signed in the blood of patriots. They are carved into the walls of field hospitals from the Korangal Valley to the Horn of Africa. They are not, however, something you would be qualified to recognize. He turned to one of the colonels beside him. Colonel, get me the Secretary of Defense on the line, and get a medevac bird on the roof of this hospital in the next 10 minutes. I want the entire surgical staff of Walter Reed scrubbed in and waiting. The colonel nodded. Yes, General. Thorne then turned his full, terrifying attention back to Finch. As for you, Doctor, he said, his voice a low, lethal purr. You tried to interfere with a life-saving procedure on a United States senator. You attempted to assault a decorated officer of the United States Armed Forces in the execution of her duty, and you displayed a level of incompetence and cowardice that I find, frankly, astonishing. He paused, letting the words hang in the suffocating silence. Finch looked like he was about to collapse. The sycophants who had once orbited him were now pressed against the far walls, trying to become invisible. When this is over, the general continued, I am going to personally, and with great pleasure, dismantle your entire career. I will speak to the board of this hospital. I will speak to the American Medical Association. I will speak to the IRS about the funding for this department. By the time I am finished, you will not be able to get a job cleaning bedpans in a bankrupt rural clinic. You will be a cautionary tale told to first-year medical students. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow louder than a shout. You called her a nobody. You have no idea what a nobody is, but you are about to find out. The general straightened up, his duty done. He looked back at Alara, his expression softening once more. How much longer can you hold, Chief? Alara hadn't moved a muscle. Her arm had to be screaming in agony, but her face was serene. As long as it takes, General, she replied, her voice steady. As long as it takes. The ghost, the joke, the broken woman was holding the line, just as she always had. The only difference was that this time, everyone was watching. The next 10 minutes were a masterclass in military efficiency imposed upon civilian chaos. General Thorne's presence transformed the ER. His two colonels moved with quiet, decisive authority, their voices calm but brooking no argument. One established a secure perimeter around Bay 2, politely but firmly moving the gawking hospital staff back. The other was on a satellite phone, his conversation a series of clipped, coded phrases. Blackbird is 5 mics out. Landing zone is hot. Package is critical but stable. Valkyrie is primary. Dr. Finch stood frozen in place, a statue of ruin. The color had drained from his face, leaving a pasty grey pallor. His Patek Philippe watch, once a symbol of his status, now seemed like a cheap, gaudy handcuff. He watched as the world he had commanded was taken from him. He tried to speak once, a weak, sputtering protest, but one of the colonels gave him a look so utterly dismissive, so full of cold promise, that the words died in his throat. He was no longer a factor. He was just scenery for his own downfall. Alara remained the anchor point of the entire operation. She was a living machine, one arm buried in a man's chest, the other resting lightly on the gurney, her posture unwavering. She coached Chloe, who was still holding pressure in the senator's abdomen, her young face a mask of terrified concentration. "Easy breaths, Martin," Alara murmured, using the nurse's last name like a military designation. "You're doing good. Just hold the line." For Chloe, it was a battlefield promotion. She went from being a terrified trainee to a soldier in the trenches, anointed by the Valkyrie herself. She would never be the same. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of an approaching helicopter grew louder, vibrating through the building's very foundation. It was a sound Alara knew better than her own heartbeat. A UH-60 Black Hawk, painted not in army green, but in the stark black of a special operations unit, was descending onto the hospital's rooftop helipad. A new team entered the ER, not doctors, but men in flight suits and tactical vests, carrying medical packs that made the hospital's crash carts look like children's toys. This was a pararescue team, the Air Force's elite combat search and rescue specialists. Their leader, a master sergeant with a craggy face and calm eyes, strode directly to Alara. He ignored the general, ignored everyone, his focus solely on the patient and the woman saving him. "Chief Vance," he said, his voice thick with respect, "PJ team is on deck, ready to take over patient handoff." "Good to see you, Smitty," Alara replied, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "He's stabilized for transport, but the second I release this aorta, he's going to crash. You have whole blood and a Belmont infuser?" "Loaded for bear, Chief. We've got 20 units of O-neg, FFP, and platelets, all warm and ready to pump," the PJ confirmed. "We'll take over compression and get him on the portable pump as soon as we're in the bird. Just get us to the roof." The transfer was an intricate, terrifying ballet. The PJ team swarmed the gurney. One took over ventilations, another attached their own advanced monitor. The original gurney was swapped for a specialized flight litter in a seamless motion. And through it all, Alara and Chloe never moved, walking in lockstep with the gurney as it began to roll, their hands still buried inside the senator. They moved through the corridors of St. Jude's, a bizarre procession. A 4-star general, 2 colonels, a team of elite PJs, and a phalanx of armed soldiers escorting a gurney being kept alive by the hands of a quiet nurse and her newly deputized assistant. Staff flattened themselves against the walls, their faces a mixture of fear and awe. They saw the ghost, their ghost, at the center of it all, her face grim and focused, a warrior queen leading her retinue. As they passed the main desk, Finch, goaded by some last, suicidal impulse of ego, stepped forward. "You can't just take a patient from my hospital," he yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. "There are protocols, paperwork." General Thorne stopped. He didn't turn his whole body, just his head. The look he gave Finch was one of profound pity and disgust. "Dr. Finch," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "the United States government is now requisitioning your patient under the Emergency War Powers Act. As for the paperwork," he paused, "send the bill to the Pentagon. I'm sure they'll get right on it." He turned and continued walking, leaving Finch standing alone in the middle of the hallway, utterly broken. The security guard Alara had disabled, Henderson, was being tended to by another nurse. He watched the procession go by, his good hand trembling, finally understanding how monumentally he had screwed up. He hadn't just grabbed a nurse, he had assaulted a living national treasure. They reached the service elevator that went to the roof. The PJ Master Sergeant looked at Alara. "Ready for handoff, Chief?" Alara took a deep breath. On my count, we release, you clamp, and start the rapid infuser simultaneously. Ready? 3, 2, 1, release. In a single coordinated movement, Alara and Chloe withdrew their hands. At the exact same instant, a PJ surgeon clamped the aorta with a vascular clamp, and another hit the switch on the Belmont, which began pumping warm blood into the senator at a rate of a liter a minute. The senator's blood pressure, which had begun to dip, immediately stabilized. The blip on the monitor held steady. Alara stepped back, her job done. The front of her grey scrubs was soaked in blood. Her arms were trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer, sustained, muscular effort. She leaned against the wall, the adrenaline beginning to drain from her system, leaving a profound exhaustion in its wake. Chloe stumbled back next to her, looking at her own bloody hands as if they belonged to someone else.
The elevator doors opened.
The team loaded the senator in. General Thorne paused at the door and looked back at Alara. "I'll have a car take you home, Chief. Get some rest." "With all due respect, General," Alara rasped, her voice returning to its softer, tired state. "My shift doesn't end for another 2 hours." A rare, small smile touched the General's lips. "Of course not," he said, shaking his head in admiration. He stepped into the elevator. The doors slid shut, and the sound of the helicopter faded as it lifted off the roof, carrying the senator towards survival. The corridor was suddenly quiet. The military was gone. The crisis was over. It was just Alara and Chloe, covered in blood, standing amidst the lingering chaos of the ER. The other staff members, who had watched from a distance, slowly began to emerge, their expressions unreadable. They looked at Alara, at the ghost, and they didn't know what to say. The woman they had mocked, the woman Finch had tried to have thrown out, had just commanded a 4-star general and saved one of the most powerful men in the country with her bare hands. Alara looked down at her own hands, the scarred one and the unscarred one. Both were caked in drying blood. She felt a familiar hollowness, the aftermath, the quiet that comes after the storm. She had done her job. She had kept death at bay for one more day. That's all it ever was. She pushed herself off the wall, her limp more pronounced now from the fatigue. She started walking toward the staff locker room, her only thought a hot shower. As she passed the nurse's station, Dr. Evans, the smarmy resident who had mocked her earlier, stood in her path. He looked pale, shaken. I've never seen anything like that," he stammered. Alara just looked at him with her tired eyes. She didn't have the energy for anger or vindication. "Get back to your patients, doctor," she said, her voice flat. "There's still a floor full of them." She walked past him, leaving him standing there, speechless. The balance of power in the universe of St. Jude's had been irrevocably altered. The ghost now cast the longest shadow in the room. The epilogue of Dr. Alistair Finch's career was swift and brutal. General Thorne was a man of his word. The day after the incident, a team of auditors from the Department of Defense, accompanied by grim-faced lawyers from the JAG Corps, arrived at St. Jude's. They didn't come to the ER. They went straight to the hospital administrator's office on the top floor. The meeting lasted 4 hours. The administrator, a man who prided himself on his political connections, emerged looking like he had aged 10 years. By noon, Alistair Finch was summoned. He was met not by the administrator, but by the hospital's head of legal counsel and 2 of the JAG lawyers. They presented him with a list of his transgressions, both from the previous day and from a newly opened investigation into his department's billing practices, prompted by a quiet word from General Thorne to a friend at the IRS. The evidence of fraudulent Medicare billing, of upcoding diagnoses to inflate profits, was damning. The incident with Senator Thompson was merely the spectacular finale to a long, sordid career of arrogance and greed. He was fired. Not quietly. He was summarily dismissed, his credentials and privileges revoked on the spot. He was informed that the American Medical Association was opening a formal review of his license and that the Department of Justice was considering charges of criminal negligence and obstruction of a federal agent. He was escorted from his office by security, not the hospitals, but two stern-faced military policemen at the general's suggestion. As he was walked through the ER he once ruled, carrying a cardboard box with his personal effects, no one met his eye. His sycophants were suddenly fascinated by their charts. The nurses he had terrorized watched in silence, their faces impassive. It was a walk of shame, more profound than any public screaming match could have been. The king was deposed, and his kingdom didn't even mourn him. He was simply erased. The next day, a new interim head of the ER was announced, a quiet, respected older doctor who had been pushed into semi-retirement by Finch. Her first act was to call a full staff meeting. Elara tried to skip it, but Chloe physically blocked her path. "You have to be there," she insisted. Elara stood at the back of the room, expecting more of the same. But the interim head, Dr. Ramirez, looked directly at her. "There are going to be some changes around here," she began. "The first is the establishment of the Vance Protocol. Any staff member, regardless of rank or title, who witnesses a critical error in patient care is not only authorized, but required to halt the procedure and call for an immediate review. There will be no retribution, only gratitude." She then looked at Elara. "Chief Warrant Officer Vance." "Elara." The hospital board, at the strong recommendation of the Department of Defense, has created a new position: Director of Emergency Preparedness and Special Circumstances. It comes with a significant salary, full benefits, and the authority to rewrite our entire crisis response protocol. It's yours, if you want it. The room was silent. Everyone looked at Elara, the ghost, the hero. They expected her to accept, to take the throne that was rightfully hers. Elara was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the faces in the room, the residents, the nurses, Chloe, who was beaming at her. She thought of the corner office, the meetings, the paperwork, the life they were offering her. Then she thought of the dying Marine she had cleaned, the feel of the scalpel in her hand, the grim satisfaction of holding the line. "Thank you, Doctor," Elara said, her voice a low rasp. "But I respectfully decline." A murmur went through the room. "I'm not a director. I'm not a manager." She paused. "I'm a nurse." She turned and walked out of the meeting, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. She didn't want the crown. She just wanted to do the work. A few weeks later, things at St. Jude's were different. The air was lighter. The constant tension that had radiated from Finch was gone, replaced by a quiet, collaborative focus. Competence, not arrogance, was the new currency. Dr. Evans, the formerly smarmy resident, was now meticulously double-checking his work and treating the nurses with a newfound respect. Chloe Martin was a different person entirely. She walked with a confidence she'd never had, a quiet authority that came from having been tested in the fire and not found wanting. Elara was still there, in her grey scrubs. She was still quiet, still kept to herself, but she was no longer the ghost. No one called her that anymore. They called her Elara, or sometimes, in hushed, respectful tones, "Chief." They gave her a wide berth, not out of fear, but out of a deep and profound respect. They saw the limp, the scarred hand, and they no longer saw weakness. They saw sacrifice. One afternoon, during a quiet moment, she was in the small memorial garden behind the hospital. General Thorne found her there, this time in civilian clothes. He stood beside her for a moment, watching the fountain. "The senator is going to make a full recovery," he said. "He sends his gratitude, and his apologies for bleeding all over your ER." Alara gave the barest hint of a smile. "It's a washable fabric, sir." A perfect, dry one-liner delivered in the quiet aftermath. "He wants to award you the Presidential Medal of Freedom," the general continued. "Highest civilian honor." Alara looked down at her hands. "I'd rather not, sir. I have enough medals. They're heavy." The symbolism was clear. The weight of her past was enough to carry. The general nodded, understanding. "I figured you'd say that. We're setting up a scholarship fund in your name at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences for combat medics who want to transition to civilian medicine. We'll call it the Valkyrie Fund." This time, Alara looked at him, and for the first time, the weariness in her eyes was replaced by a flicker of genuine warmth. "I'd like that, General. I'd like that very much." He left her there in the garden. She stayed for a while longer, feeling the sun on her face. Her work was not done. It would never be done. There would always be another patient, another crisis, another line to hold. But for the first time in a very long time, she felt like she was in the right place. Not a battlefield, not a hospital, but somewhere in between. A place where her scars were not a source of shame, but a testament to a life of service. She was no longer hiding. She was simply home. The world is full of ghosts like her, quiet veterans who carry the unseen wounds of their service into the civilian world, their skills and sacrifices invisible to the people they walk among every day. Look closer. The person stocking a shelf, driving a bus, or cleaning a floor might just be a hero hiding in plain sight. They've already earned your respect. All they ask is for a little bit of it.